This is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell, all talk and all crime. From white-collar suburban dad to bank robber, the true story of the Boonie Hat Bandit. That's tonight on Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Donald Keith Giammanco is prisoner number 1214070 at the Western Missouri Correctional Center. He was a successful independent stock options trader and the loving single father of twin daughters. Suffered financial ruin during the Great Recession, and in 2007, with no money and a foreclosure notice, Keith made the ill-fated decision to rob banks. He eluded law enforcement, became known as the Boonie Hat Bandit. Finally caught after the 12th robbery, he pled guilty to all 12 in federal court, sentenced to 6 years and 4 months. St. Louis County then used his guilty plea and conviction in federal court as evidence against him for 7 robberies that occurred within its jurisdiction. In state court, he was sentenced to 20 years. A clemency effort now underway for what Keith believes is an unjust conviction for the same crimes twice, considered by many a violation of the double jeopardy provision guaranteed in the Constitution. The book out now about the story, Banknotes, the true story of the Boonie Hat Bandit, by Keith's wife, Caroline Giammanco. She met Keith in prison where she was teaching prisoners at the time. Keith joins us now from the Western Missouri Correctional Center, a.k.a. prison. Thanks to the folks at the Missouri Department of Corrections for setting up the interview, and to Keith's wife, Caroline, who contacted me and urged me to do the interview with someone she believes in. Welcome, Keith. How you doing this morning?
I am doing very well, Jim, and good evening to yourself and the listeners.
Okay, right off the bat, tell us how you're holding up.
I'm doing fairly well under the circumstances. I mean, it's difficult being away from my family. I have made a conscious effort not to become a part of the culture that exists that most people are aware of inside the prisons, and I have great support, of course, from Caroline and Elise and Marissa, my 2 girls, and I would say fairly well under the circumstances would be my answer.
Okay, you have 8.5 years remaining if you don't get clemency until you're up for parole, I guess. There's a 5-year ban on visitation by Caroline, which I guess ends in October, she told me. Does that make it tough? I mean, you must have some great spiritual strength in there.
Oh, absolutely. It's very difficult, and yes, I consider myself grounded very well spiritually, and we turn to God for many things that occur in our life, not only on a day-to-day basis, but in the macro sense also. Like you said, coping with this and getting through day by day, but not only that, but looking at what worst case scenarios are, and also with hope and prayers for best case scenarios to happen.
Okay. Tell folks what prison's like. What's a day in the life there? Are you in a max prison still?
No, it's actually considered medium security now.
Medium security. Okay, tell us what a day's like there.
Oh, well, it's regimented, of course. There are, custody counts. There's recreation periods where there's a gym, library available, those types of things. And, of course, meals are done between certain hours of the day, between, 5:30 and 6 for breakfast, 6:30 for breakfast, and, so on and so forth for lunch and dinner. I do a lot of reading, and I watch some television. We have televisions, of course. And, I buy and eat snacks off the canteen, and I don't converse a lot. I do a lot of observing, though, of my surroundings, and not only the surroundings themselves, but personalities, both staff and inmate.
Do you view yourself in any danger there?
No, not on a daily or minute-to-minute basis. I think not being involved socially in the prison system is a good way to stay safe.
Interesting. Now, when you were in a max prison, there was a lot of fear of danger.
Yeah, I don't know about personal fear because of, what I previously just mentioned, the aforementioned, but I think that I observed quite a few things like, stabbings and really bad beatdowns and fights and things like that. And there's a lot of fights, frankly, where I'm at now.
Okay. Wow. All right. This is from the book. No one gets up in the morning with the intention of ruining his life. Tell us what you were thinking, how this happened.
it happened. It was actually, as you know, the book describes. It was premeditated and thought out, and basically treated as a business transaction, for lack of a better term. It wasn't anything that I did in panic mode. I did research, and my thinking is that it had to be a substantial amount of money, and it had to be fast, and nobody could be hurt.
That is one of the things that really hit me, is that you did a lot of research on bank robbery, and you almost made it seem like it's pretty fundamentally easy because of the way that the banks set it up. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, yeah, it is. I mean, and, I had discussions with the FBI agent that interviewed me about this, and he asked me, of course I was under no obligation to answer, but he asked me, how did you plan all this, and how did you get away with all this? And I told him, I said, you helped me. You're the ones who gave me the information I needed in order to do this on your website. And basically what I did was and this is all described in the book, I think, fairly thoroughly, but what I did was I looked at the the website, and researched it, and I looked at how people got caught and the cases that were still open and what they did and what the descriptions were and how some people got caught and how some people didn't.
And basically you also made sure you had no weapon on you, right? And the protocol, I guess, on bank procedure is not to put up any kind of resistance.
That is correct. And yeah, I mean, all of those things are available, that type of protocol and procedure, and that's why that I knew a bank was, like the old saying, of course, why did you rob banks? Because that's where the money's at. But not only that, there is no resistance, and they're instructed not to put up any resistance. So therefore, there's no weapon necessary, and nobody needs to be hurt.
You're in financial distress big time, and you're devoted to your twin daughters. What was your thinking in terms of the risk seemed so huge that you were going to end up hurting the very people you were trying to help? Was your mind not operating 100% on, were you just under too much stress, or what?
Well, I think it wasn't operating 100%. I think that would be safe to say for anybody who would observe this from afar, or any forensic scientist or psychologist. But the fact of the matter is of course, I had no intention of getting caught. Mm-hmm. And I believe that the reward at the time for them, I was thinking, was greater than the risk. Of course, in hindsight, of course, I feel a lot different about that. And, of course, the girls and I have had discussions about that and what I should have did versus what I did. And I'm so thankful that they still support me and are still with me and are still standing right beside me, not behind me or in front of me, but beside me.
By the way, I have twins. So, in fact, we are going to do an interview with them and Caroline as a second show on this. Have you done psychological insight into yourself? I mean, I know the book says you were a people pleaser. Your dad left when you were really young. Did you put some of those pieces together in your own mind?
Sure, absolutely. I've had a lot of time to think about those types of things, and I think it's important, though, that when you're looking at those types of things in hindsight, at least it's important to me, not to make those observations in the scope of trying to place blame on something. Mm-hmm. And it's very important to me that people know that I take 100% responsibility for everything that has happened throughout this whole experience. Most importantly, the robberies themselves, because I think it's important that those were my actions only, and no one else is to be blamed for those.
All right, we're going to talk about it, have you take us through one robbery as an example, but where did the Boonie Hat Bandit name come from?
That was a moniker given by the FBI. And I don't think very many people know that, and they may or may not, but these monikers that are given to people who are robbery suspects are given by a person who specifically does that as at the FBI for anyone who is a suspect in 3 or more robberies.
I understand.
So actually,
go ahead.
Actually, the name wasn't something that was our brainchild or any kind of publicity stunt or anything like that. It was given by law enforcement authority.
I understand your twins think that hat's pretty ugly ass.
They do, and they are not very fond of the moniker or the name at all.
All right.
They said that from the outset.
Can you take us through one robbery from your mindset to the start to when you're getting in your car and all the stuff you did in the car even? Go ahead.
Well, I think that in most of them, in a general basis, I had already cased out the bank and made sure that it was close to an interstate highway access and had a parking lot that would be congruent with easily getting out and onto that. So I would already know. I would be prepared with an envelope and a note and somewhat of a disguise, being a hat or my hair dyed or growing a beard beforehand for a few weeks, and then, of course, shaving it off right afterwards. I would basically go into the bank, posing as a customer, walk up, wait in line if there was a line, walk up to the teller, hand them the note, not say anything, and then take the money and casually walk out and go to my car, which would usually be parked between 2 high-profile vehicles, so nobody could see what type of car I got in, and I wouldn't go to standalone brick-and-mortar buildings. A lot of times the building itself might be, but it would be adjacent into a large shopping center parking lot, so I could kind of blend in when I got in the car and drove away.
Were you nervous?
I think during the first couple I was, but I wouldn't describe it as nerves. I would describe it more as anxiety. And then after the first couple, I pretty much treated it as a business, something I needed to do in order to meet the bills that were on the table.
Apparently, at one time you robbed a bank and deposited in another branch of the same bank.
Correct, because I held an account in that bank. And it's a large commercial bank that everybody's familiar with, that we're speaking of.
Okay, why 12? Were you going to be able to stop? And finally, was there relief when you were caught? Which I think you're going to say not. And I've done a lot with Bernie Madoff, and he was very relieved when he finally got caught.
My answer to that is no. Absolutely not. And there was a point, that was what one of the detectives for St. Louis County said to the media after I was caught. And, they said, well, he was relieved, as a matter of fact. Never asked me that if I was or wasn't, and it was totally a falsehood and incorrect. But I think that relief definitely is not a word, and as far as, yes, I had a stopping point, which I was about $30,000 away from.
How'd you get caught?
And I would have quit at that point. What did you say? I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Jim.
No, go ahead. And you're confident you would have been able to quit, and the question was, how were you caught? I
can guarantee you I would have been able to quit. And I think that being, a lot of people think that this is something like an addiction, and it's not.
Yeah.
I had a goal that I needed to meet, and when I would have met that goal, I would have quit. And an interesting thing, the judge in St. Louis County, the judge that sentenced me, said that he was confident that if I wouldn't have been caught, that I would have continued doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And I just sat and listened, and I said, buddy, you don't have a clue.
Mm-hmm.
What's going on here.
How'd you get caught?
Well, there was a vice president at the last bank, of course, that I robbed, which is evident. Actually, it was the last one. He said this is what he claims, because he testified on the stand in the trial. He claims that he told one of his coworkers while he was sitting in his office, "That's the Boonie Hat Bandit, and we're being robbed." And then he ran out, got a description of my vehicle, followed me out, which is totally against bank protocol. Followed me out, got the license number and a description of my vehicle, and they caught me about 2 miles down the road from there.
As we get to our last...
After a short period of time where I gathered my thoughts and just went ahead and pulled over, and of course they had, 50 police cars and 2 helicopters and the whole thing, like it was the crime of the century.
Wow.
But
2 minutes to go in this segment. What was the arrest process like and getting booked and all that, and I guess put into a county jail?
Oh, it was very interesting. Actually, I was put into a huge holding tank with after I was I'll call it an interview, because an interrogation wasn't necessary. And all this is very thorough. Caroline does such a great job.
Yeah, she did.
In this book of describing these things and making them very interesting and not mundane, because they weren't actually. It is a very interesting process. I was put in a big holding tank, and the interesting thing is that they had televisions mounted to poles in this huge holding tank. And, of course, when the local news came on, I was on it. And everybody in there was pointing and looking and, had people wanting me to sign autographs and all kinds of strange things. And, of course, I was not I don't want to use the word mood, but I certainly wasn't in a humor to entertain those kind of things at that point, because basically what I was thinking about at that time, because I hadn't been able to call anyone, my daughters, and or my mother, my late mother, who was still alive at the time, to let them know what was going on, and then all of a sudden, bam, I'm on the news, and I thought, okay, the girls probably aren't watching the news because they were, 17 at the time, but my mother most certainly knows. So, and I was kind of bummed out because I wasn't able to let them know what was going on before the media did.
I bet they were pretty stunned. This is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll get to, was Keith a victim of the justice system, in our next segment. So stay with us.
Robert Reese with the CEO Show Minute here with Jim McCann, CEO and founder of 1-800-Flowers. You're known for great customer service. Give me an example.
We have stories about extraordinary delivery situations where a fellow in an airport, he decided, his girlfriend gave him an ultimatum and said, if you don't propose to me by the time I leave for Paris with my family on vacation, don't call me again. Well, at the last minute, he decided this was a good thing and he shouldn't miss out on it. And he asked if we could engineer delivery to Kennedy Airport on Long Island to get these flowers with a proposal to his girlfriend to say that, in fact, he did want to marry her. So we had a delivery guy make a special arrangements with the Port Authority police to get right to the gate with the bouquet, and he knelt down and he read the card message to her while her mom and dad and her sister stood there, and he read the proposal to her, and he had a cell phone in his hand saying, if the answer is yes, I'm instructed to call Richard and put you on the phone with him. So we have photographs of that situation. It was covered by the local TV station because they got wind of what was going on, and it was a great story.
Thanks, Jim. Robert Reese on the CEO Show Minute.
We're back with Keith Giammanco, suburban dad, in prison right now for committing robberies. By the way, you're very articulate, Keith. Are you way above your status there in the prison versus other folks there?
Well, I don't think that. I don't think it's my place to answer that. I think that
you're too modest.
No, it's the truth, though. I think that everybody has their own niche in society. What I would like to do is basically, like I said, be here as an observer for the public, and to let them know what's going on with their system and their tax dollars, both in the court system and the penal system. And I think that that's how I can give back to the communities. One of the ways that I can give back and make restitution for what I've done. Well
said, and we'll get to that. Now, we're going to get to how you've been victimized, but is it, you understand, obviously, that people's sympathies are not going to be necessarily in your favor, at least in the beginning, right, when you rob a bunch of banks?
Absolutely, and rightfully so. I mean, the crimes themselves are nothing to be boasted about, and they're very serious. And I have apologized many times over and did it in the way that I could articulate it the best. And those apologies are both in print and available verbally to all of society for that. So absolutely. I mean, the crimes are serious, and I expect absolutely no sympathy or empathy for the crimes themselves.
Just asking to be treated fairly, and we're going to get to start talking about that, a double jeopardy issue and ineffective counsel issue. You felt you're sort of like on an assembly line to conviction, right? Tell folks a little bit about the process and how you sort of got stuck with bad lawyers and on and on.
Well, I think that, when a high-profile case like this comes on the media, there's many attorneys that come out of the woodwork to want to represent you, both for fees and pro bono, and because, of course, they want the publicity and to be able to go on camera and in print and say that they're your attorney. So I had to process all those things and all of the people and pick what was best. And, of course, we didn't have any money, obviously. It only makes sense that we had no money to pay a high-profile, high-dollar attorney. And some of them approached me and, of course, wanted more money than we could afford. And then the two that I finally settled on, one of them was a younger guy who was very green, but he worked for a very well-known law firm and said he had their complete backing and their help and their experience and everything, which didn't turn out to be the case. So, and the other older gentleman who has passed away since that represented me was a former federal prosecutor. Well, it turned out that, you can take the lawyer out of prosecution, but you can't take the prosecutor out of the lawyer. Which is a whole other subject.
Actually wanted you to lose, right? Or
well, I don't know if they know how to win from the other side. That's the question that I have about that, and we go into that in detail in the book. But anyway, I went ahead and pled in federal court, of course, being told that, once you plea in federal court and you take a sentence, the state is going to drop this. Knowing well that I had studied the whole time I was in the county jail about dual sovereignty and the use thereof, and the state's ability to actually prosecute and convict a second time and punish for the same crime, which is obviously a breach of all of our rights.
What is dual sovereignty? Because it's sort of unknown. It seems completely in conflict, obviously, with double jeopardy.
It is. It's actually a doctrine that was written in the early 1800s to basically settle a case that was a financial case out of Maryland. And the way they're using it today, basically what happened there is somebody stole money from the city of Baltimore, the state of Maryland, and the federal government, and they all wanted a piece of them. So this was a way to convict that person. And we're talking about 1833 here, so it wasn't like yesterday that this happened. But the Supreme Court has upheld it in cases like bank robbery, where both the state and the federal government have jurisdiction to let them both convict and punish. There was a case in 1959 called Barkus versus Illinois, and it was upheld again in 1973 in a case that is Heath versus Alabama, I believe it is. But anyway, this is basically something that has been upheld, and wrongfully so, in everybody's opinion that we've ever asked this publicly.
The was law enforcement, why were they so hostile to you? Because you embarrassed them by this, or what? Because you seem to get, as you know, just poor treatment throughout this.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think that that's the case, and it was never meant to be that way. And why would? Okay, I kind of liken it to why would other than basically Bob McCullough, the county prosecutor in St. Louis County, is an attention fiend himself. He loves the media and loves being on the media. So he was going to use this doctrine, which is very rarely used in not only in the country but in this state itself. As a matter of fact, there's 26 states that there is a law against prosecutors prosecuting a second time when the federal government's already convicted for the same crime. And most of the other states that don't have a law, they generally don't practice it anyway. And there were 5 robberies in the neighboring county that I committed in St. Charles County, and they referred it over to the feds and didn't prosecute me.
Interesting.
So
why, Keith, would aside from the question of why you were tried in both courts, how could they come up with a 6-year sentence in the feds and a 20-year sentence in the state?
Well, the sentencing matrices are a lot different. I mean, you know, a first-degree robbery in which we fought that it was a first-degree robbery versus a second-degree robbery. And again, all of this stuff is in Banknotes, The True Story of the Boonie Hat Bandit, how this all happened. And I think people, and we are talking about this and doing this for everyone, not just for us, because I don't think people understand how many rights that they have constitutionally have been lost through case law and Supreme Court rulings over the years. And you don't know until this happens to you. But I believe that the sentencing matrix, I know that the sentencing matrix for the federal government is cut and dry, and I pled to that. And then the maximum that I could have got under the sentencing guidelines under the federal sentencing matrix was 81 months.
Mm-hmm.
And she sentenced me to 76, which was right in the middle of the guidelines there.
Mm-hmm.
So, but first-degree robbery in the state of Missouri carries 10 years to 30 years to life. So I was looking at being exposed to a possible life sentence for the same thing I got 6 years and 4 months for in the federal courts.
Wow.
So that's not very congruent, is it? I mean, I asked the question. It's just, I think it's one of the problems that we have in this state is excessive sentencing, along with the same mandatory minimum requirement as the federal government.
Which is 85%.
Yes, that is correct. And that's a whole other fight that we're fighting right now.
Yes.
Is the excessive sentence with the mandatory minimum attached to it.
So let me ask you, was it a mistake not to plead in the state court? And you had lawyers that apparently didn't even prep right for the defense.
Correct, because they thought that I would be bullied into pleading by them and the judge and the prosecutor. And of course it wasn't a mistake. I did the right thing through and through, because if I would have pled, first of all, the state prosecutor did not offer me they did not offer me a plea bargain with a specific amount of years. They wanted me to plea open or blind in front of the judge. And I refused to do it. I wasn't exposing myself to a judge that I knew was biased against me, to a 30-year or a life sentence, because I would have got it. I was much better off taking the chance with 12 jurors of my peers.
And obviously, you had no chance of being found innocent, right? Because you already found guilty in the Fed court.
Well, absolutely. And even if we could have fought this case on a robbery-to-robbery basis, by law in Missouri, they are allowed to use my federal plea for these robberies against me. So, I mean, how is that a fair trial? I ask the question.
So are you appealing on ineffective counsel as well?
Correct. Absolutely, I am. I'm definitely appealing on ineffective counsel because they were ill-prepared. They tried to abandon me. I tried to let them go, and the judge would have none of it. So basically what we had a client who wasn't satisfied with his attorneys and attorneys that didn't want to work for their client and were made to by the judge, which under Missouri law, the client has the right to terminate his attorneys at any time during the process.
Do you were your rights to a speedy trial violated?
Absolutely, they definitely were. A federal law says that you have 8 months to try a defendant. I never continued the case one time, nor did my attorneys, and the state continued the case 7 times. I was in the county jail waiting for trial, personally ready to go to trial, whether my attorneys were or not, for 23 months.
Wow.
And of course, this whole time, the federal proceedings were going on. So I contend that, and it's obvious through evidence, because the docket even says that they asked for continuances pending outcome of federal case. So therefore, they were delaying the case in order to have an outcome in the federal courts so they could use it against me in the state courts.
Wow. All right, we're going to return in our last segment to where the process is and what they're trying to do to get fairness. But I want to talk a little bit about family now, the importance of that. Your twin stuck by you. Tell us how you met Caroline, and then somehow you end up in the hole in basically isolation with no violation history there inside a prison.
Absolutely, and I still have no violation history because they couldn't find any wrongdoing between us. I applied for a job as a tutor in the adult education program, also known as GED, in the prison system to basically help tutor and mentor other inmates through to get their high school equivalency. And Caroline hired me. She was working as the teacher in the classroom, and we got to know each other. We talked about current events, our family, and of course curriculum with the students, and we very simply, not intending to, we fell in love. And once I think that the staff members thought that there was things going on that weren't, there was nothing, and the investigator himself spent months, about 4.5 months investigating this, and of course there's cameras all over the place, so they had nothing. So I sat in what's called administrative segregation, or the hole, for 4 months, the better part of 4 months anyway.
Pretty brutal, right, those conditions?
Oh yeah, the conditions are brutal. I mean, you shower once every 3 days. You get your 3 meals a day shoved at you through a chuck hole. You can go outside for an hour at a time every other day.
A lot of brutality, too.
And then, of course, it's in like a dog cage where you can go outside. So,
and there's a lot of
literally
a lot of stuff you can read in the book about what goes on there, right, with prisoners, etc.
Absolutely. And I think people will be very interested in reading reading that. At least I hope so. And like I said, Caroline did such a wonderful job.
Good writer. Now, let me ask you this, though. Let's talk next about the twins. How did they support you? And they were key in as character witnesses, right?
Oh, absolutely. In the trial, I mean, like I said in the book, I mean, they saved my bacon as far as sentencing goes, because in the sentencing phase of the state trial, they testified on my behalf, of course, as a character witness. And the jury, even some of the jury members even told them afterwards that they loved them and they were definitely credible and believable about the kind of person and who I am. And, of course, the jurors were misled about what they were actually sentencing me to, which is all in the book. I think people will find that very interesting. But, family is everything. And Elise actually reiterated that fact to me the other day on the phone, and it is so true, and I am so thankful.
Okay,
to God and to them for sticking by me. And, and you know what it's like to have twins. I mean, it's a special thing.
Yeah, it's an amazing.
And they have a special connection that even we don't understand as parents.
That's exactly right. And they'll cut us out if they stick together, put it that way.
No question about it. I mean, I can describe stories when they were kids where I was actually punishing one of them for doing something to the one of them, the other one, and then the other one would come to their defense.
Oh, every time. It was even
every time.
But it was worse. What even worse is they might be fighting with each other, and as soon as we said something, boom, they were together against us.
Absolutely, and that's basically what I'm describing. You did a better job of articulating it, but I mean, it's such a wonderful thing to even observe.
Okay.
I mean,
now,
it really is.
As we get down
I love them to pieces.
Last minute, so I guess we have to be quick here. You talked about the importance of family. Were you abandoned by the rest of your family and all your friends? Yes. Other than one close friend, and my immediate family has completely abandoned me. And I have one cousin that occasionally writes me, and I write her back out on the West Coast. But yes, abandoned by a stigma, which Caroline describes in her second book called Guilty Hearts. You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. We've got our final segment coming up, Justice and Criminal Reform. Talking with Keith Giammanco, victim of double jeopardy in a Missouri prison right now. And that's my first question. What are the next steps you're taking in the process?
We have, well, Caroline has just launched a clemency effort, and of course with the girls and some people who are definitely sympathetic to having their own rights, not only mine, but their own rights violated by this second conviction. So there's a wonderful clemency effort underway through postcards, petitions, emails to the governor's office and to legislators.
Is that for excessive sentencing or for the double jeopardy? What's it focused on exactly?
It's basically focused on the double jeopardy issue, but it's also for excessive sentencing in comparison to the federal sentence.
Yeah.
Now, people, of course, can go online to freekeithgiammanco.com and look up all of the things and the reasons as to why we are looking to have this clemency granted. Now, the second thing is there's also a federal appeal that was formulated by Caroline, myself, and a wonderful attorney named Kevin Snyder that we have hired that was filed about 3.5 years ago. So the federal judge is still reviewing these claims of double jeopardy, right to a speedy trial, ineffective assistance of counsel, and all of these. There's actually 21 claims that we put into 6 for the appeal to the federal judge. So it's still under review.
Well, how much chance do you think you have of winning that?
I hate to put a percentage on it. What I can tell you is that we formulated some of the claims with outside of the box type of questions towards the system and the law where there is no precedence set on the way that we have formulated these claims. So I would like to think that under an objective review that we have a pretty good chance.
Interesting. The 85% mandatory minimum, you're trying to reduce that too, and you make some good points in the book that there's no incentive for a prisoner to try and rehabilitate himself if he knows he's stuck for the vast majority of the sentence.
Absolutely not. And and that's just one of the things that there's no incentive for. Make no mistake. Our penal systems in this country are not about rehabilitation, no matter what they claim. People need to stop drinking the Kool-Aid. I'm here, I observe it, I see it. And it has nothing to do with rehabilitation. It's all about keeping their lemonade stand open. They love the revolving door, where people keep coming back in a high recidivism rate.
Jeez.
It's called job security. It's called a rural jobs program. But yes, we are working on trying to get it's basically an unfunded mandate at this point, because the states implemented the 85% mandatory minimum on A and B felonies in order to get federal monies that was offered for doing so. But those federal monies have long since dried up, like 5 years ago. So the states, and in Missouri's case, the Missouri taxpayer is being strapped with an entire bill for people who have 30-year sentences at 85%. That is, like I said, an unfunded mandate now.
Keith, there's folks in prison that obviously can be rehabilitated like yourself. What percentage of the people you think should even be there beyond some time, obviously, of serving their crime?
I would say that everybody's sentence that is, I would say, that falls under an A or a B felony should probably be reduced quite a bit. I would say 30% of the people that are in prison now that are serving extended sentences, let's say 15 years or more, are as ready as they're going to be to go home. Plain and simple.
Do you see, is the political climate in Missouri, do you think, will be not hostile to the clemency effort?
I think that people are willing to look at an individual case more than they are an issue like the 85%. It's unfortunate because the legislators are afraid. They have, as Caroline calls it, Chicken Little syndrome. They are afraid to attack something that is a burden to the taxpayer and actually enhances the risk to public safety versus helps it. But in the name of public safety, they don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole because they don't know how to, articulate it to their constituents that this is helpful to get somebody ready for society faster and get them back out there instead of being a part of this violent, hateful, criminal culture that we call prison.
How much contact now do you have with the girls and Caroline?
Oh, constant. I talk to the girl. I talk to Caroline several times each day.
Oh, you do? And do you have email with them, or?
They can email me. I can't email them.
Okay. They send me letters and cards, and like I said, I have phone contact with them on a daily basis. Which keeps you going, right?
Oh, no question.
All right. In the last minute, one of the interesting comments is that you feel you became whole and free, but you were in prison. Explain that.
Oh, absolutely. Through the love of my family and meeting Caroline and us becoming one and having a family unit formed and supporting one another, I am so much freer than I was trying to negotiate and navigate life, raising kids, and finding out who I was as a single person, which was lost, obviously. And I am much freer now to be who I am in an honest way to everybody than I've ever been in my entire life.
And you're all right, or you've gotten over the fact that so many of your folks, from your family even to friends, have abandoned you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, life has to go on. We have to move on with things, and I certainly am not one that is going to look back and, I have no hate towards them and no animosity. I just, Caroline and the girls are much more adamant about that than I am, and rightfully so. I don't disagree with them, but I think our focus should be on what's going to happen the next hour, the next day, the next month, and so forth.
And I say you have a heck of a team with the three of them, and it would look like a heck of a case with the way that the system has treated you. I want to thank Keith Giammanco. We again are going to have a second interview with his wife, Caroline, his twin daughters, Marissa and Elise. We'll get the story from their perspective as well. Caroline's book is Banknotes, The True Story of the Boonie Hat Bandit. What's your website again for the clemency?
It's www.freekeithgiammanco.com.
And spell Giammanco for folks.
GIAMM as in Mary, ANCO.
All righty, we appreciate your time. This has been Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll see everybody again next Sunday at 6 p.m. for another edition of Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. This is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell, all talk and all crime. From white-collar suburban dad to bank robber, our second show on the true story of the Boonie Hat Bandit with his wife and twin daughters. The family perspective. Tonight on Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell, Keith Giammanco is a prisoner in the Western Missouri Correctional Center. He was a successful stock options trader, loving single father of twin daughters, suffered financial ruin during the Great Recession, and in 2007, with no money and a foreclosure notice, Keith made some ill-fated decisions to rob banks. He eluded law enforcement, became known as the Boonie Hat Bandit. When finally caught after the 12th robbery, he pled guilty to all 12. In federal court, sentenced to 6 years, 4 months. St. Louis County then used his guilty plea and conviction in federal court as evidence against him for 7 robberies happening within its jurisdiction. And in state court, he was sentenced to 20 years. A clemency effort's now underway for what Keith believes is an unjust conviction for the same crimes twice, an apparent violation of double jeopardy protection guaranteed under the Constitution. It's all memorialized now in a book written by his wife, Caroline, The Banknotes, The True Story of the Boonie Hat Bandit. She's also the author of Guilty Hearts, The World of Prison Romances. She joins us now, part 2 of the Boonie Hat Bandit story. How are you, Caroline?
I'm doing pretty well. Thank you for having us on, Jim.
No problem. I enjoyed it. Very insightful. Keith, in your book, says, he didn't wake up with the intention to destroy his life. I assume you didn't wake up with the intention to marry somebody in prison. Tell us how you met and the brief version of the story.
Both Keith and I were very unlikely candidates for ending up in what people would consider a prison romance. I had grown up in conservative southern Missouri. My father was a deputy sheriff. I grew up around the courthouse and the sheriff's department. We were very law-abiding people, and I went to the University of Arizona and got a degree in political science. I'm a public school teacher. And just as Keith's life was coming apart during the Great Recession, mine started on its own downward spiral as far as economics. The district that I taught at here in Missouri had lost a lot of its funding. When people started moving out of the district, the tax base started to plummet. They had to reduce their force, so I lost my job. And I substituted for a while, but then I put in an application with the Missouri Department of Corrections and was called to see if I'd be interested in an academic teacher 3 position, which I was because I needed a job. So I was teaching at the prison for about a year before I ever even met Keith. And he interviewed to be my inmate employee to tutor students in my classroom. And that is how we met. And Keith had sworn from the time that he was arrested and in county jail in St. Louis that he was never going to become romantically involved with anybody while he was in prison. He had kind of a groupie following that started writing him letters in prison or in jail. And it made him really uncomfortable because his story had made national headlines and his crime spree had gotten a lot of attention. And there were women propositioning him through the mail when he was in the county jail, and it completely repulsed him. And he thought, no, I am never getting involved with anybody while I'm in here. And then we met. So
tell us
it
how
wasn't something that either of us was expecting.
So tell us how it happened then. He's assisting you, and you played all by the rules. There was no violation of fraternization. You didn't bring contraband or everything. But tell how it happened. And also, it just seems so brutal teaching there, the backbiting and everything.
It was a very hostile work environment, and not just because of the inmates. There was a lot of corruption and ugliness that went on within the Department of Corrections, and it seemed as though the people at the top had a compulsion to always try to drive wedges and keep suspicion amongst coworkers. We'd be told basically that everybody was watching everybody else very carefully and ratting on each other. And it made for a very difficult work situation because you were always looking over your shoulder and concerned that somebody was going to go lie about you and say something about you that wasn't true. So it was just a very difficult situation, and there were some people that were retaliatory and vindictive inside there, and it was kind of ironic because they at one point started putting up posters around the prison saying that bullying wouldn't be tolerated, and one of the posters hung outside one of the offices of the person who bullied me the worst when I worked there. So it was a very stressful situation, and then on top of that, you're dealing with rapists and killers and people like that. So it was a very tense place to work. Not
pleasant. So you got married in prison. Tell us how that happened. Did you actually have a ban on visitation rights?
Yeah, it's kind of a long story, and we explain it in Banknotes, and I'm also writing a book about my experiences. Banknotes is mainly about Keith's story, with me coming into it towards the end. I'm writing a memoir of my own called Inside the Death Fences that talks about everything that happened from the day I interviewed at the prison. And a lot of people may say, oh, well, she just got her head turned by some manipulative inmate. And I felt like it was important to write Inside the Death Fences because I wanted people to see that what I experienced had nothing to do with Keith. And so towards the end of Banknotes, I talked about exposing some corruption that was going on with a high-level person there at the prison, and they started targeting me. And to go after me, they locked Keith up first, and so I quit. And even though we were cleared in the investigation by the investigator there at the prison, we were still placed under a 5-year visiting ban. So we haven't been able to see each other since October 23rd of 2013. And during this time, we have kept in constant communication. We write, we call, and I, a couple of years ago, started putting in the paperwork to allow us to get married because I knew that we could still get married even with the visiting ban. And we met a bunch of roadblocks, and finally I had to get some state legislators involved, and we were able to get married this last October 23rd.
All right, and we should say when you say they locked him up, since he was locked up, they put him in the hole, which is basically solitary confinement for a guy who had no write-ups. Now tell us, outside of prison, you were shunned by a lot of friends and even your own brother. Talk about that.
Yeah, there is such a stigma attached to people who are connected in any way to an inmate. And I hadn't even realized the viciousness of it because I had never looked at people that way. But as soon as my brother found out that Keith and I were in a relationship, he broke all ties. He disowned me because of it. And we did not make amends until he was on his deathbed. And I didn't even know that he was ill. He had cancer. In between him disowning me and us making amends, he had come down with cancer, and his wife hadn't told me, and he hadn't told me, and my brother was on his deathbed when I found out. And I drove to St. Louis, and we were able to make amends. But it's very painful when people that you love completely turn their back on you just because they feel superior to anyone who's in prison. And Keith is not what people envision when they think of the typical inmate. Most people think of some kind of street thug, someone who's tatted up, who's violent. Keith is truly a middle-class dad who made poor decisions, but he never touched anybody, never hurt anybody. He's not a violent person. He is not anyone to be afraid of. And yet I was treated as though I was bringing some sort of disease into the family.
How did you keep your self-esteem?
From the certainty of who Keith and I are as a couple. That is what has been keeping me going.
How do your sons, I know you have two sons, I think, one an Iraq veteran. How do you, from your perspective, how do you think they've handled it, and how do you think his twins have handled it?
My youngest son was wounded in Afghanistan, and my other son was in the Air Force. My oldest son has been fairly accepting of it, and he'll talk to Keith on the telephone, and they get along really well. Both of them were not keen on the idea of Mom being involved with an inmate, and I had some difficulties with them in the beginning. My younger son still doesn't approve of my relationship, but at least we're talking now. And as far as the girls go, they have gone through hell, dealing with the shock of their dad, who was everything to them. He was a single parent, and he was stripped away from them. They had no idea. They had no idea that he was robbing banks, and it all came crashing down on them when he was arrested. And they both dealt with things in their own ways. Thankfully, I can say that they both come out the other side doing well, but it's not as though it hasn't taken a toll on those two girls. And I'm grateful that they have accepted me into the family, and there's never been any tension or jealousy or discord and between the three of us, which is important because in any step-parent situation, you run the risk of there being hard feelings one way or the other. And thankfully, we have all looked at this as being a team.
And we'll say again that we're going to interview the twins for the back half of this show as well, so we'll get their perspective. Tell us, when did the visitation ban end, and when's the earliest Keith could get out?
The ban ends on October 24th, so we're coming up in about 6 months. And the soonest that Keith can see a parole board is in 8.5 years.
All right. I should say for folks, the Guilty Heart book gives you great insight into several different couples that have had to deal with this issue as well. And you get a sense that these aren't just bad guys. They may have made mistakes, and they really pay for it. And there's some pretty tough stuff in there. There's young kids who were raped repeatedly. And
while in prison.
While in prison, while in prison, and what the wives have to go through, sometimes just to afford, to be able to pay them on the phone. All right, let's shift efforts. Now we're talking with Caroline Giammanco. She's the wife of a suburban dad who turned bank robber. Your mission now is essentially criminal justice reform. There's 2.4 million Americans in prison, and to help Keith get treated with justice. We should say he's under his sentencing. Not only was he sentenced with huge disparity to the same crime twice between the state and the federal, but he has to serve a minimum of mandatory 85% of that. Tell about the clemency effort, what you're doing now.
Right now we have an effort going on where we are having people sign petitions and legislators contacting the governor's office, asking Governor Eric Greitens to review Keith's situation for clemency. we acknowledge that he made mistakes. Keith admitted from the time he was arrested, he admitted that he had robbed those banks and that he had done something wrong. That's why he pled guilty in federal court, and he pled guilty to all 12 of them in federal court. He never tried to weasel out of anything. And we all hear that we're protected under the Constitution from being convicted twice for the same crimes. And we always assume, well, bank robbery is a federal offense. And it is. He took responsibility for those crimes. He was sentenced in federal court and was given what the federal court deemed was the proper sentence. He would have been home 3.5 years ago if it had ended there, but it didn't. St. Charles County, where 5 of the crimes took place, they referred everything to the feds as soon as the federal conviction took place. But St. Louis County took the 7 that happened there that were part of the 12 he'd already pled guilty to and used his guilty plea and conviction in federal court as evidence in state court to give him 3 times as much prison time. And as you said, they made it a Class A felony, which meant that he has to serve no less than 85%, which is 17 years. So Missouri taxpayers have paid for 100% of his incarceration. And even though he would have been home 3.5 years ago, Missouri taxpayers are still paying for his incarceration for, at the very least, the next 8.5 years. And I met at a book signing one time in Chesterfield, Missouri. Just by chance, this man walked in and he saw me there with banknotes, and he said, wow, I was on that state jury. And we got to talking. And he said, well, he's home, right? I said, no. And I had to explain the situation to him. He had no idea that the judge had tacked on 5 more years than the 15 that they had recommended. He had no idea that what they had sentenced him to meant he had to serve no less than 17 years. The jury thought that when they said, oh, okay, we'll go along with the state and we'll convict him for these, but, you know, good time behavior credit and all that, he'll be home at the same time as he would the federal sentence, so no big deal, right? The juror had no idea that Missouri doesn't offer good time behavior credit. There is no, well, you'll get a day off for everyone you serve. That doesn't happen in Missouri. And so part of the problem is that jurors need to become educated. If they get called into duty, they need to start doing some research of their own to find out what they're actually sentencing somebody to, because the prosecutors aren't going to tell them and the judges aren't going to tell them. Nothing was explained to them. And so this man was completely appalled that Keith was still in prison at all, let alone at that point had almost 10 years left in his sentence before he could even talk to a parole board. And it's really sad how even the people who prosecuted or who convicted him in state court didn't realize what they were really sending him off to.
What's the website for the clemency petition?
People on Facebook can go to Free Keith Giammanco, and they can also contact me at Caroline Giammanco Author on Facebook. They can email me at booneyhatbandit@yahoo.com, and I can get in contact with them that way to give them information.
Okay, and Giammanco, by the way, is Giammanco. Why do you think law enforcement was so hostile to him, sort of out of proportion?
I think it's because
he embarrassed them?
He embarrassed them.
Yeah.
When he was arrested, the night he was arrested, the federal agent, the FBI, told him, if you had stopped at number 11, we never would have known who you were. They had no idea who Keith was. And if he had just stopped robbing banks, he probably would never have gotten caught, because they said they had no idea even where to start finding who this was. And people need to understand that personalities do come in to these kinds of things. The St. Charles prosecutor saw no reason to go after Keith for a second conviction. The St. Louis prosecutor, he's pretty well known across the country, Bob McCullough, he is the same prosecutor as Ferguson. And first of all, he loves high-profile cases, but also people have to keep in mind that his father had been a police officer who was killed in the line of duty. His entire family is involved in law enforcement in one way or another. And I'm sure he was really ticked off that Keith made the St. Louis area police look so ineffective. So he was going to show Keith and put him away for as long as he possibly could.
We got about a minute left in this segment. You haven't been impressed with the courage of politicians in the state, eh?
No, I haven't. They have Chicken Little syndrome too many times, where they're afraid that they might insult the prosecution. Let me start over. They're afraid that they might insult the prosecution community. They are afraid that, well, they might not get reelected, or what would people think? They don't want to look easy on crime. This has nothing to do with looking easy on crime. This has to do with what's good for our state budgets and what is the moral thing to do.
All right, we'll be back in our second segment with Caroline Giammanco, the wife of Keith Giammanco, in prison for becoming a suburban dad who went into bank robbery. Be right back. We're back. This is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. We're talking with Caroline Giammanco and her efforts now for criminal justice reform. On this mandatory minimum 85%, I was interested in explaining this, that Bill Clinton put this in originally for really political purposes.
It was completely political. In the election cycle before Clinton ran for president, Michael Dukakis had been running in the election cycle before Bill Clinton ran for president. Michael Dukakis had been a governor, and he was ahead in the polls against H.W. Bush until it came out that Willie Horton, a man that he had, under his administration, allowed to go out on a furlough from prison, Willie Horton had gone out and committed heinous crimes. And that came back to haunt Michael Dukakis. And the Bushes painted Democrats as being weak on crime. So Bill Clinton was determined when he ran for president that he was not going to look weak on crime. So he came up with the idea of having a very harsh Clinton crime bill. And Joe Biden is actually the person who wrote the bill. And many things happened under that bill, but 85% was one of the components of the Clinton crime bill. It rose the federal sentencing to 85%, where people had to serve at least 85% of their crimes for Class A felonies. And under the Clinton crime bill, if states would adopt the exact same percentage of 85%, that the federal government would give them funding incentives. So what states did, and not every state, but Missouri was one of them, was they raised their mandatory minimum sentences for Class A felonies to 85%. Prior to 1994, Missouri had 40% mandatory minimum. So if you were convicted of robbery and you got a 20-year sentence, you had to serve 8. Once the Clinton crime bill was accepted in Missouri, it rose to 85%, which meant you served 17 years of those 20 years. But it seemed like a good deal for the states because millions of federal dollars started flowing into the state. The problem happened when in 2003, 2004, the state legislators saw that it was such a good moneymaker that really what they needed to do was expand the umbrella of who qualified as an 85% criminal. So first-degree robbery is what it's now called here in Missouri, used to be armed robbery. Armed robbery, by definition, meant you had to have a weapon. For first-degree robbery, you don't have to have a weapon. You just have to, it says there has to be a possible threat that somebody could say, well, he could have had a weapon. Keith never had a weapon, never said he had a weapon, but it's really not that hard for a police officer or a prosecutor to talk to a witness and say, well, did he have a weapon? And they go, well, no, he didn't. He didn't have a weapon. Are you sure he didn't have a weapon? Well, I didn't see one, but could he have had a weapon? And the witness says, well, yeah, I guess he could have had one. That's all it takes to get a Class A conviction.
And I should say that the prison population exploded in Missouri from 5,000 to 35,000. And in irony now, I guess the feds are no longer providing that cash incentive, so it's now unfunded and costing the state a lot of money. Tell us though that what it does it turns the criminal into basically a sense of hopelessness, right? Instead of thinking of rehabbing himself.
Exactly. So first-degree assault's another one. It used to be attempted murder. Now you just have to inflict serious bodily injury, which could be anything from a broken jaw to riddling somebody with bullets. There's no distinction within the statute itself. So if you are a 19-year-old kid and you've gone to a party and you get into a fight that maybe you were looking for, maybe you were not looking for, and you end up seriously injuring the other person, you can be charged with first-degree assault, which is the same as first-degree robbery. If you get 20 years, you have to serve no less than 17 years. If you are 19 years old and you go into prison, first-time offender, never had any criminal background, you go into prison and you have to serve no less than 17 years, you're going to be 36 before you get out of prison. It doesn't matter how good you behave in prison, you're not getting out any sooner than the guy who's been a complete jerk his entire prison sentence. So there's no incentive to being good or rehabilitating because you're stuck in there no matter what. And most guys who are 19 and they're going to be 36 before they get out, they're going to get swallowed up by that prison culture, and they are not going to come out that same good kid they had been before that one horrible incident happened in their life.
Okay, Caroline. Also a victim of ineffective counsel, and I guess his right to speedy trial was violated. Talk a little bit about those.
His defense attorneys had volunteered to take on Keith's case pro bono, which meant they would do it for free, and they were looking for the publicity that would bring, but they did virtually nothing to help him at all. In fact, they were encouraging him to take a blind plea in state court, which meant he would say that he was guilty and he could have ended up with life in prison. And Keith felt that it was better to go the route of a jury trial, and his defense attorneys were angry with him. They were mad because he wouldn't just go with the blind plea, and it's very complicated and it's explained in detail in banknotes, but they basically fed him to the wolves.
Now, as we get down to the end of our segment here, where's your mind at now in terms of the appeals process and the next steps and the odds you think of being able to get him out before that 85% period hits?
There's really no way of having any idea of even how to gauge where it's at, except that we're looking at it as good news that it hasn't been denied yet. The clemency effort, we think, is definitely something that if we get enough public support, that Governor Greitens will look kindly upon Keith. He has granted clemency to other people already early in his term, so we're thinking that Keith is definitely worthy of consideration. And the 85% mandatory minimum change as far as legislation here in the state of Missouri, I'm finding that to be probably the least likely, even though you would think it would make more sense because it will help our state budget if they make changes. But politicians, like I said, they've got Chicken Little syndrome too many times and are afraid to do something that might make them feel uncomfortable. And it's ironic that they were more than happy to vote this 85% requirement in when it meant money was coming in.
Yeah.
It was fine for them to do something draconian if it meant money was coming in. But now that the money's going away, they're so stuck in their ways that they just don't even want to help the state financially by getting out of something that Bill Clinton even says was a huge mistake.
Okay, our last question. When he does get out, what are you guys going to do?
We're going to continue building our lives together, and we're going to work to bring about criminal justice reform. It's not as though when Keith gets out, we're just going to say, well, we're done with it. Who cares what happens? We truly, passionately care about making the system work better, not just for inmates. This isn't just an pro-inmate situation. I testify at subcommittees at the State House in Jefferson City to make working conditions better for DOC employees. We want things to be better and safer for our communities when people get out. All
right, we've been talking with Caroline Giammanco, her mission now, criminal justice reform. Banknotes, The True Story of the Boonie Hat Bandit, and Guilty Hearts, The World of Prison Romances are the two books that she's got out there. You heard her say she's got a third. You can go to her Facebook page to sign on to the clemency petition and learn about the case. You'll see the Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll come back with character witnesses, Keith's twin daughters. And now we're joined by the character witnesses that Keith Giammanco believes helped him both in court sentencing when they spoke on his character and as a core of a very small support team allowing him to survive in prison. And I'm speaking of his twin daughters, Elise and Marissa Giammanco. They join us right now. And welcome, ladies.
Hello. Hi.
Good to have you. As I was saying, I had twin daughters as well. I know that the twin bond is kind of twins against the world. Did that help you guys dealing with this situation?
Yes, sir. Definitely.
All right. How did go ahead. Let's do one at a time on this one now. How did each of you find out he'd been arrested?
I'll go
Marissa.
first.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'll go first, and I'm Marissa.
Okay.
I know it's hard to tell us apart. Well, we heard a knock on the door. It was late at night, like midnight. Tons of cars outside, bright spotlights. I remember running to go get some shorts because I was in a long night shirt and had no idea who it was. Opened the door, tons of police officers. They said, your dad is safe, but he's in a little bit of trouble. And then they proceeded to show me the warrant because, of course, I asked. And then they proceeded to search the house.
And was Elise there too, or?
Yeah, I was there too. I was actually the one who opened the door, and Sis was behind me. We were both at the door, and
did you freak out?
Asked for the warrant. No, I think we were both in shock. I was a little perturbed that because it was pretty late at night. You know, it was after 11, around midnight. And the flashlights that they had were shining in our window too, and that's kind of like when I stood up in my bedroom, I was like, "What's going on?" That's the first instinct that I had, and then went to the door, and then that's where we saw the police officers. When they came inside, I was again, like, I think I was in shock. I don't want to speak for my sister, but I wasn't freaking out. I was definitely trying to stay calm and reserved before I made any assumption about what was going on with my dad.
I know.
So that's what I was thinking.
I know Keith said he was really upset that he wasn't able to call you. Now, how did you? Go back to Marissa. How were you able to process this? Since obviously your dad had never been a crook or a criminal before.
Right.
Well, it wasn't processed right away. I wouldn't even say it was processed within the first week. I do remember from that night, after the initial come-in by the police, after they searched the house, I do remember us going to bed together in my sister's bedroom, in Elisa's bedroom, and we slept with the phone by our bed. But nothing was really processed until weeks after, I don't believe, and from my perspective.
Let me ask this. He was raising you as a single parent, and now you feel like you've lost that single parent at the time. Did you feel like you've been abandoned or orphaned or what?
Oh yeah, this is Elise. Definitely sense of abandonment, definitely, because we were both 17 at the time, because we got arrested in September 2008. We turned 18 October 2008. And I definitely had this sense of, what am I going to do? How am I going to get through this? Who is going to be my support network now on the outside, like beyond just my twin sister? Like, what adults can I rely on? So those were the immediate questions I was asking. And, like, the feelings that I was feeling, the emotions were fear, abandonment, just like shock, and deep, deep sadness, because I knew that this was going to be like a very, very long uphill battle, right?
When did you get to talk to your dad?
He ended up calling the next morning, and he was in the county jail at the time from where he called from. And he, I remember him saying, hello, beautiful, and I'm safe. And I remember him saying, you don't have to go to school today. And that's one thing I do remember. But that's my perspective. And now, Sis, I would like to hear what you remember from that moment.
I remember talking to him briefly, actually, that night, because he called when the police was there for, he only had 20 seconds, though. And he was just like,
I don't want to tell you what's going on right now. I want you guys to go to bed and stay safe. I remember him saying, I'll be home soon.
Wow.
So that was the first time that I talked to him, and that's what I remember. And then the next morning, I remember you were talking to him, sis. And so that's the conversation that you guys had. And then I might have talked to him for a second, but I don't remember that.
Okay.
That's the conversation I remember.
All right, so let's go back to Marissa then. So we just talked about feeling abandoned when he gets arrested. Did a lot of your friends and other family members sort of disown you or turn their backs on you at the same time or thereafter?
That was a gradual process. In the beginning, it was more like somebody had died. Like, they literally, were bringing us food, and, if you need anything, I'm here, and
wow.
And that was the initial reaction by everybody around us, I believe. Money? And, yeah, they offered us some money, and, if you, like you said, school supplies, and our church members were involved for the first month, but gradually everybody kind of just dropped off.
Did you guys start going right back to school?
I think I remember, if I'm quoting myself correctly, we did go back to school, but I missed 75 days of my senior year.
Wow.
So I went back, but I was on and off really there.
Wow.
So
were either of you angry at him and had to forgive Keith, and did he ask for your forgiveness?
Yes, to both.
Okay.
I would say, this is Marissa, on my part, It was less of an anger thing and more of a disappointment and a why thing for me.
Marissa, I think, go ahead and finish.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm Elise again, back to me.
Yep.
I think, I really echo what Sis is saying. I think there's a lot of emotions there, and I think I still revisit some of those emotions even today. And I think it's a constant process of acceptance.
Marissa, in the book, The Boonie Hat Bandit, it talks about you developed a drug problem for a while. Did you link that to anything about the stress of this or not?
I've thought about that over the years. I have 3 years, 6 months clean from heroin addiction.
Congratulations.
Congrats.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that, guys. And anybody else there that's out there listening, there is help. You just need to turn to it. But back to the question, Jim, I would say that I think that I would have developed it whether or not my dad had got arrested, because I think that I was already involved in the wrong culture and the wrong crowd. And that's my personal opinion about my personal drug addiction that I did have. Like, I was already, smoking weed, hanging out with the wrong people, drinking every day from the time I was 12 years old. And I hit that very well because my parents already had their own problems going on. And so either way, I think it would have developed.
Very honest. Okay. Let me ask each of you briefly as we get down to the end of this segment. Was it a burden at such a young age to really be the main support network of your father?
Yes, because I think this is Elise, I think I was struggling being my own support network at that time, especially after he got arrested, because I was the one working after school and supporting myself financially, emotionally, mentally, and now here's this other person who's supposed to be doing that for me, and I'm doing it for him. So that's a reversal of roles at such a young age. So it's a child taking care of a parent who's more in a childlike situation, who can't take care of himself, right?
Mm-hmm. Do you feel, Elise?
Very overwhelming.
Do you feel, Elise, that's been reversed now, that you can go back to being a normal, kid, and although you're an adult now?
I think there are other portions of my life that are abnormal because of my father's incarceration that isn't financial so much. I'm 27 years old. I have my own career.
Right.
I support myself now. My peers are doing the same. So we're on more equal footing now. But when it comes to going to family dinners and going home for the weekends and quote unquote stuff like that, that is still very abnormal and a big, big hole in my life.
This is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell, 1490 WGCH in Greenwich. In our final segment, we'll have more family perspective on the Boonie Hat Bandit story. We're back with the twin daughters of the suburban dad convicted of bank robberies in the St. Louis area. I'll start with Elise here. Do you feel your dad was let down by the justice system? He was tried effectively in state and federal courts for the same crime, sentenced 6 years in one, 20 years in the other. His lawyers were pretty lousy. He has to serve 85% mandatory minimum of his time. What do you did he get screwed by the justice system?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that hundreds of people do every day. I just want to point that out. I don't think my father's an anomaly in getting screwed over. I think that his sentence was, too long, too harsh. Getting tried twice for the same crime, that's just, you hear growing up that doesn't happen, but in reality it does in a few states in this country of ours. So I definitely agree with my dad on that sentiment. I definitely think his lawyers were not very passionate about helping my father, if that makes sense. So that's my perspective on it. And they were older. They were on their way out.
Well, let me ask you, Marissa, then, how often do you get to see your dad in prison? Do you go to see him?
I personally only get to go every maybe 6 or 7 months.
Wow.
Because of the drive time and the downtime from work.
Elise, how about you?
I probably go 3 or 4 times a year, so not that much more. And I went to college in Wisconsin, so it was even less when I was away. And because he's up in Kansas City and we're down in St. Louis and Cape Girardeau, and so that's a 4.5-hour drive.
All right, let me ask you this: you guys talk to him on the phone a lot, though, I know. Do you in some ways feel closer to him now, even though you can't really physically be with him that much?
Yes, this is Elise, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
When my dad got arrested, that gave us a unique opportunity to be completely honest with each other, because that put him in a vulnerable position. He didn't really have a choice. Why would he keep lying? Why would he keep doing that? He needed our help, and so that broke open, for me and him at least, an honest relationship that I carry throughout my life since I was 17 years old. So I feel like we know each other and we respect each other and we listen to each other on a deeper level than we would ever have had if that hadn't have happened in our life. Maybe. Might have came about in another way, maybe a more positive way, but that's the way I see it.
Very interesting. Do you guys worry, Marissa, about keeping his morale up in prison?
Whenever he calls, I try to make sure, even if I'm in a bad mood, to try to just put on that happy face for him and, just let him know that things are okay on my end and how are you today, I'm more worried about his mental well-being. I fought my battles, so now it's all about trying to get him through his battles,
Very nice. How do you deal with the fact that he's got 8.5 years to go if the clemency or appeals are not successful?
I take that day by day. I take my life day by day.
Probably smart. Okay. Elise, let me ask you this. He met Caroline in prison when she was teaching, and he was sort of helping him, tutoring, etc., helping her. And then you became a team essentially. How did that come together? How did you take Caroline and given they met in prison and everything?
Okay, so I am like a diehard romantic, so maybe this is very subjective, but I really believe that love knows no bounds. You don't choose who you fall in love with. And so taking that idea and perspective, I really didn't have much thought about the way that they met. I was surprised. I was like, no way. But Caroline is wonderful, and she's extremely intelligent, and we both get along really well together, and so that just is a blessing, and it really wasn't hard to accept her, at least into my life. So,
yeah, she's a very impressive woman, and she's really speaks highly of both you guys to me.
Aww.
Let me ask Marissa this now. The family members that are really not speaking to you guys or have disowned you or whatever the issue is, are you hoping to reconcile all of that at some point?
I don't really care too much. I've made my own life for myself. It comes down to, if you see me on the street, are you going to say hello? Because I will. So will they. And that's all that matters. That's the type of person that I am. No harm, no foul. Nothing held against them at all. it's all about how they react to me if they ever saw me again.
Well,
but I'm not going to reach out.
How about you, Elise?
I really agree with you, Marissa, about that. I have the same opinion. Like, if they wanted to reach out to me and, like, ask me how I was doing, I can't tell you how I would respond because I think it's a day-by-day thing. I wish them no harm, but I have my own busy, full life with people who I know love me, and that's what matters to me.
Wow, you guys are more mature than the older adults are, and by the way, I'm personally very happy because I can now tell your guys' voices apart.
Yay! Takes a second.
Have you had boyfriends? How have they been in terms of your dad being in jail?
Sis, do you want to start that one off?
Yeah, all of the relationships that I've had, and I've been with the same man for almost 6 years now, which we met on the street, and he's also a felon himself, so he can relate to that culture, and he knows how hard it is. So, and he knows how hard it is for family as well. But even the relationships that I had before that, they were great. Like my ex-boyfriend John, like, who was there during the initial arrest, like he was one of my biggest supporters, you know. So it's been good on the relationship side, definitely. No problems there at all.
All right, I want to finish up. We'll start with Elise. If you have a message that you want to convey to your dad, or that you would like to say, or if you have a message you'd like to convey to listeners, go ahead, Elise.
Yeah, so to my dad, I love you and I support you and I wish you well always. And to listeners out there, I think specifically for people and children, younger people with parents in prison, like, you can have your own life and you can do great things, and there's support groups out there as well. You just have to look for them and to take care of yourselves, and that's to everybody, really. So I think we really need to take care of ourselves and love ourselves more in order to, like, love others. But That's my message.
Wow, Marissa.
So my message to my dad would be that I love you and miss you and hope to see you home soon.
There you go.
Also, my message to the viewers, take care of yourself, like my sister said. Don't worry what other people think of you. And create your own life for yourself. Create a sanctuary for yourself. And don't let the small things bother you from day to day. And take time. Just take time for yourself and your family members, for sure. And that's what I would say.
Well, I have to say, you guys are living proof that a tragic situation, you can turn it into growth for both of you guys. We've been talking to the twin daughters and the wife of the Boonie Hat Bandit, Keith Giammanco. They're both loyal, full of love. They hope that he will get out before his mandatory minimum sentence, which would be 8.5 more years, but either a clemency petition they're working on or getting the 85% mandatory minimum. And I know from my talking to Keith, he's a highly intelligent guy who obviously could do a lot of productive stuff back in society. Thanks to Elise, Marissa, and Caroline Giammanco. Caroline's book is Banknotes, The True Story of the Boonie Hat Bandit. This has been Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. You can get our podcast, WGCH.com. You can go on YouTube, search Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell or Park City Productions 06604. And we'll see everybody next Monday evening at 6 for another edition of Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell.